The story of Joseph. It makes a brilliant story for kids, and it made an absolutely incredible musical. And it's a story we all know. Or do we all know it? I don't know about you, but over the last few weeks, months, when we've actually not been able to worship close together, when we've been watching, like this, videos, or whether we've been watching television when the BBC condescended to do a few weeks, it's come across to me really strongly that we're not very careful about the language we use in church. That means language that other people understand, and we make assumptions like saying, "You've all heard this story." Well, sadly in many churches that might be true, but when a lot of people that don't go to church actually are watching, they might not have heard the story before. And even if they've seen the musical, they might not recognise it as a story that comes from the Bible. And the story of Joseph, of course, is of this young lad who is, well, he's not very kindly looked upon by his brothers, and he's sent out up into the fields to fetch them back in when they're playing with the sheep. Only that isn't quite what the story says. Joseph is actually the firstborn of Rachel. Now Rachel is Jacob's second wife, and Rachel is the wife that Jacob always wanted. It's the wife he worked 14 years for. It's the wife that he loved. And so Joseph was his favourite son. Joseph was his son, and he was given the fancy coat. Now scholars will argue whether it was multicoloured, whether it was made out of wool, whether it was decorated with all sorts of things, whether it had long sleeves. None of it matters. The fact is, he was given a coat. Now, not too long ago, even just over 100 years ago in this country, you could probably tell exactly the station in life people were by what they wore. You could probably tell what job they had. And if you were a fisherman, you could tell which port they came out of by looking at the pattern on their woolly. And in Joseph's time, that was the same. And so to have a coat meant that you had authority. Jacob gave him the authority of his father, Jacob. And so this did not please the brothers. And when Joseph himself decided to come back with some dreams that said that you're all going to bow down to me, that definitely didn't make him very popular. Now the brothers all had their job to do, and they went off to take the sheep to pasture. Now we think of taking the sheep to pasture in a nearby field. Well, actually Jacob was living in Hebron, and he sent them off to find pasture and sent Joseph after them to see what they were doing. And they'd gone up to Shechem. Now Shechem was about 40 miles away across rugged mountains. So it would probably be a few days. I don't know whether he walked, whether he rode a donkey or a camel, no idea. But it wasn't an easy journey. And when at last he got to Shechem, they decided to move on to Dothan, which was another 10 miles away. So off Jacob trotted. That was Joseph, by the way. Off Joseph trotted to find them. And of course Dothan is actually on a major highway for traders from the north down towards Egypt in the south. It goes round by the coast. And when they got there, when Joseph got there, they decided that the brothers were going to kill him. Well, that's what brotherly love does for you. But they didn't. They threw him down a cistern, and then along came the traders, and they sold him for 20 pieces of silver. You may have heard something similar in the New Testament. And actually, historically, the people of the church have often looked at the story of Joseph as what they're called a type or an allegory of the story of Jesus, of somebody who was sold and taken away, sent by their father and then sold, this time into slavery. I'm always a bit bothered about types and allegories. I prefer to think like Jesus did of parables, of putting stories alongside each other instead of trying to find people that you can say, well, Joseph's like Jesus and his father's like the Father in heaven. But no, just put the story alongside of our lives and alongside the story of Jesus. And we see Joseph being sent off to Egypt and sold to a man called Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was a fairly important man, and Joseph, when he got there, worked hard. And in fact, if you look at the story, there's a change. In the Bible, there's a break, there's an interlude between this first part of Joseph's story and the rest of Joseph's story. They put a little bit about Judah in there. And something happens to Joseph in this interlude. In the first part of the story, God is never mentioned. Even in the dreams, even in the interpretation, God is not there. God is not part of the story. And yet, later on, now that Joseph is working for Potiphar, there has been a huge change. Because he works hard. He doesn't say, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm important. He actually gets on with things, and as a servant he gets to the highest point in the household and becomes in charge of the whole household. But he's by this time a fairly eligible young bachelor. And Potiphar's wife decides, he's a nice looking lad, this. And she decides that she'd like to know him a little bit better. And Joseph has to say no. And this is where God comes in, and this is where you can see the change, because Joseph now not only says that he won't do this because of loyalty to Potiphar, but because of loyalty to God. A God who is now with him, a God who he feels is beside him. It wasn't a good thing to do to turn down Potiphar's wife, because he was still a slave. And when Potiphar's wife decided to complain about him to Potiphar and claim that he had done things that she didn't want him to do, he was immediately put into prison. No trial, he was a slave. Immediately, he was from somewhere important to nowhere. And yet God was with him in the prison. He managed to work hard in the prison and actually worked to become what you might call senior trustee. He was the man who the person that ran the prison looked to control the other prisoners. And he got to be well known. And so the baker and the cupbearer to the Pharaoh himself decided that when they were thrown into prison and they had dreams, they would go to Joseph to ask him to interpret them. And Joseph immediately said a very strange thing in a way. He said, God knows the meaning of the dreams. And the phraseology is such that what he's actually saying is, why don't you just talk to God about it? And so it's obvious that now Joseph is in such a place after being in this prison that he regards God as so close to him he can just chat. And because he's so close, he interprets the dreams, and both of them come out as true prophecies. And of course, later on, when the Pharaoh decides to have dreams and couldn't find anybody to interpret them, eventually he hears about Joseph, and Joseph goes to interpret his dreams. And he says the same thing to Pharaoh. He says God knows the meaning. And because God knows the meaning, Joseph knows the meaning. And he tells him that this dream means 7 years of good and 7 years of famine. And then a wonderful thing happens. Pharaoh decides to put Joseph in charge of everything. He comes from a prisoner to being next to Pharaoh in importance in the country. And it's an incredible change. It's also an incredible, well, not just a change in Joseph, but the fact that Joseph is accepted into the Pharaoh's inner circle. He's given an Egyptian name. He's given an Egyptian wife. He's given all authority under Pharaoh. And the interesting thing is that the name that he's given in Egyptian means God speaks and is alive. It means that Pharaoh himself had recognized in Joseph a faith in God. That it wasn't just that Joseph was a clever man. Joseph was a man who was close to God. Now, of course, there were many gods in Egypt, and Pharaoh didn't particularly mind. He was quite happy for Joseph to look to his God. But obviously it made an impact on the Pharaoh. And while you might think and look and think, well, Joseph's gone astray. Look, he's gone to the other side. He's joined Pharaoh's court. He's even taken an Egyptian name. He's got an Egyptian wife. Interesting thing is that his wife that was given is the daughter of a priest of a sect that worships the sun. And maybe that gives a little bit of a twist to that little prophecy of his dream right back at the beginning, where the sun and the moon will bow down. Maybe it wasn't just mum and dad. Maybe it was a bit more than that, because Joseph and his God is beginning to be recognized. That he hasn't ditched his God, he's taken God with him. And so Joseph rises to be this incredibly important person. He in fact wears a cloak of authority that nobody could have even thought him able to wear. And because of that, when the famine comes and his family comes, he can teach them a bit of a lesson. I won't go into all the details, you can look it up in the Bible if you like. And eventually he's reconciled to his family, and Jacob and all the family come to live in Israel, to live in Egypt. I do get mixed up myself sometimes. They all come to live in Egypt. And it's in a way a wonderful story, that. And it explains, of course, as well, how Jacob and his family, Jacob called Israel, end up in Egypt. And it's interesting in the Bible to note that this whole story doesn't start off with the subtitle, The Story of Joseph. It starts off with the story of Jacob, and then talks about Joseph. This is the story of Jacob called Israel. This is the story of a faith journey. And this is the story of a man called Joseph, who as a 17-year-old boy is rejected by his family, put in a pit, literally, and then sold into slavery, and finds in that experience the God of his ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of his father Jacob. And in that finding, finds himself and rises to a very high position. And yet, he's sold into slavery at 17, and there is absolutely no record of him ever being anything else but a slave. Even when he is second to Pharaoh in authority, it is Pharaoh's authority, and he is second. He is a servant. He was a servant when he was sold, and he is a servant when he has the cloak of authority. He is, in a way, if you think of the parable and put it alongside the nation of Israel, he is the suffering servant. If you put it alongside the life of Jesus, Jesus came as the one who was to serve and not to be served. Above all, Jacob was a servant of the people, of the Pharaoh, and of God. You know, it's amazing when you think that Jesus came to serve, sent by his Father to serve and to give of himself. Sometimes we look at the cross, sometimes we focus on the cross, and sometimes we think that Jesus came to give us his death. But he didn't. He came to give us his life. He came to give us his life in the life that he lived before the horror of the crucifixion. He gives us his life as he comes to us even today as the risen Christ. He is the one who offers us that life as no one else can. He is the one who offers us the freedom of the servant, the authority of the one who is next to his Father, to our God. When we, like Joseph, can turn to our God and say, Father, and he speaks to us and we speak to him, without dreams, without anything in the way, but simply the fact that as his servants, our Master is gracious in all ways, forever. Amen.